Get started. Well, I guess one more person's coming in. So my name is Carson McKinstry. I am one of the co-organizers for Free Code Camp OKC. So today we're actually going to talk about ES6, so one of the newest versions of JavaScript. Before we get started, I wanted to thank Starspace 46 for the space, as well as Techlahoma for sponsoring us, and then obviously Free Code Camp. Without them, we wouldn't be here. So let's get into it. Maybe. Okay, so like I said, my name is Carson McKinstry. You can find me anywhere on the internet pretty much with this hashtag or with this handle. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the first things we're going to talk about, I guess, a little bit of background. So ES6 is the 6th version of a language called ECMAScript. It was released in 2015, and it added a lot of additional things to the language that we didn't have before. At least there's a lot of syntactic sugar that makes it a lot easier for new programmers or older programmers to come in to start working with the language. So JavaScript is the name that is given to ECMAScript. It's sort of the normal, and it's what we use for just basically talking about it every day. Okay, so first things we're going to talk about. So there's some new variable types. So normally in JavaScript you'll see var. So this is going to be, it's technically block level scoped. And it is mutable, which literally just means that it is changeable. On the other side of things is that var is also can be considered globally scoped, which has a lot of, you can run into a lot of issues with that particular, with the way that that variable works. So ECMAScript 6 introduces 2 new variable types. So there's let and then there's const. So let is similar to var in that it is block level scoped and it is mutable, but there's a little bit of a trick to it it's not globally scoped. So if you get outside of a block of code, which is just basically any code between 2 brackets, the let inside and the let outside are going to be 2 completely separate variables. The other one is const. This is the one that I use pretty much all the time, no matter what. It's supported in every major browser. Const is block level scoped, so it's very similar to let in that regards, but is immutable. So what immutable means is that it can't be changed. There's nothing you can do to it to change it. There are a couple exceptions to that. So arrays and objects can both be quote unquote changed, but the type that it is, so it can't, the type that it is can't change. So you can't take a const and declare it as an object and then say, oh, later on I want it to be a number or I want it to be a string or something like that. It'll actually throw a type error. And don't worry about pretty much all of this for now. What I'm going to do is we're going to go through these slides, and then I've got what's called a REPL that I'm going to show off some of these. So next we've got some advanced or enhanced object literals. So object literals, so objects in general in JavaScript are these sort of encapsulated pieces of data. So there's a couple ways that you can actually declare them. This is one of them, and this is actually showing off what you can do in ES6. So above what you can do in ES6 is you can take, there's a lot more shorthand now. So before, if I wanted to declare, say, I've got this new object named Carson, and I wanted to give it a name property. If I'm trying to build that object from variables that I've declared previously, before I would have to say name colon name or age colon age, and then say name colon say name. And up above, say name would actually have to be declared as a function. So now what you can actually do is you can just use that variable in the object. So that name gets set to whatever the name variable is set as. The age gets set to whatever the age variable is set as. So this function, you can do inline functions with objects now. And we'll get into a little bit what that means later on. So this is just an easier way to actually declare objects, and it makes life a little easier as you're passing stuff around. So next we're going to talk about string literals and this idea of interpolation. So string literals use the backtick character. It's the little character next to the 1 key on your keyboard, or I guess on most keyboards. And it looks something similar. It looks like this. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it allows you to use variables inside of your strings without having to do this funky, weird quotation marks plus something else. Now you can use the $ plus curly brackets, and then you can declare, or you can use a function. So like here we're using the object from earlier to define our name. And then I want to also give the age, so it's just, I'm using the variable, so Carson.age. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about destructuring. So destructuring is something that I find amazing. So say you're given an object or an array in this case. So you've got my object and then my array, and each of those has some sort of properties or values inside of them. So down here, it's right here. What I'm doing there is I'm declaring val1 and val2, and then I'm setting it inside of curly braces, and then I am setting it equal to that object, so that my object. So what this will do is it'll pluck those values off. So val1 will end up being equal to 1, val2 will end up equaling the number 2. The same thing can go with array. Same thing can be done with arrays. So we've got this array that's just got 2 values, number 3 and the number 4. Down at the bottom right here, we are pulling those off. So eventually we will have a val3 and a val4 with those values in them. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about classes. So who here is more familiar with sort of the object-oriented programming world? So C#, Java, so quite a few of you. So this is going to be similar to what those object-oriented languages offer. It's technically some syntactic sugar around constructor functions, which I'll show you here in a minute. But it does very similar things to what a normal class would do in an object-oriented language. The one thing you have to keep in mind is that JavaScript is a prototypal language. So any functions, anything else gets attached to the prototype rather than the class itself. So these are some really, really nice things that we have now in JavaScript. So the default, the rest, and the spread operators. So these are some operators that are sort of, I would call them quality of life operators. So the defaults, whenever you are now declaring a function, you can give a variable inside that function a default value. So if something is passed in that either returns an undefined or a falsy sort of value, or it's not input at all, it will automatically default to this value. So right here we've got a function. It takes x and y as arguments, and if it doesn't receive a y when it's being called, it will automatically set to 0. Next is going to be the rest operator. So similar here, we've got x and y. So what the rest operator does is it'll actually pass any additional arguments you give to the function as an array. So say you've got a function that only takes 2 variables or 2 arguments. If you pass it more than those 2 arguments, the second and anything after that will be put into a single array. I haven't found a use for it just yet, but I'm sure there is. So the last one is going to be the spread operator. So the spread operator looks very similar to the rest operator, except it's used in expressions rather than inside of the arguments on a function. So what this does is it allows us to now copy, concatenate, combine any sort of arrays and objects. So we've got this new new array, and we've got two arrays previously defined, so R1 and R2, and that will take all the values in those arrays and basically pull them out, and then form this array. Does that make sense? So you can also do this with objects. So this really comes in really handy with objects. I think there was a sort of riddle, I would call it, a couple weeks ago in the Free Code Camp Slack channel. So what happens when you just set an object to another variable? So you assign the object, and then you assign it again to something else. You're going to have a bad time. I'll let you guys play with that a little bit to find out why that doesn't really work. But this takes care of that, and it sort of makes it a little easier to use. This actually allows you to do copying of objects and copying of arrays without those weird side effects. Let's see. So the next one, this is my favorite thing about this entire version of JavaScript, are arrow functions. They are a new optional syntax for declaring functions. So I'll go into what that looks like first. So down here we've got two functions that do the same thing. They take an array and they reduce it down to a single number. So in here, we've got this anonymous function right here. Looks a little scary. Whoops. So you've got an accumulator, some number, and then it returns some value. And mind you, these two things are equivalent. And I'll show you what this looks like here in a minute when you're just using a regular function. So one of the gotchas that actually happens with arrow functions is that they don't bind the keyword this. So typically, if you're using an object and you refer to this inside of it, it will refer to the object itself. That doesn't happen with arrow functions. Or if you use this inside of normal functions, it will refer to the function itself. This goes up one level, I guess you would call it, and it actually refers to the block of code outside of where you've called it. Let's see. So yeah, so like I said, both of those are equivalent. And I will show you what those actually do when you are just using a normal function. So the problem with ES6 is that and this is just the problem with JavaScript in general, is that a lot of times some of the features you want to use might not be supported by every browser. So every browser decides to take the JavaScript standard, or the ES6 spec, and implement it their own way. So that's why you always hear the jokes about Internet Explorer always being a little slow about the uptake on new features. It's because the people at Microsoft are slowly adopting new features rather than putting them all in whole hog like browsers like Chrome do. So the way that we get around this is we actually have to transpile our code. So what that means is that we take our code and we translate it into another. Basically, we take our ES6 code and we translate it into ES5 code, which is much more usable with older browsers. The other way we can do this is actually to use Node. So this is what I do a lot of times for my personal projects, is I'll use Node in order to do that, in order to actually use ES6 by itself. So certain versions of Node will allow you to do that. So if you're not familiar with Node, it is a platform that you can use on your computer to run JavaScript without a browser. And one of the transpilers, by the way, is Babel. I'll show you that website here in a second. They've got a playground you can play with to see what actually happens when you type in ES6 code, what it looks like in ES5. So here's some resources. So I'm going to go ahead and put these slides up into the Free Code Camp channel and go ahead and put them on the meetup as well. But so the first thing we've got is actually a list of ES6 features. So this is the full list of those features, including some that I didn't really talk about today, just because they're a little more advanced and you don't see them as much. The next one is going to be babel.js.io. That is just the transpiler that I was talking about a second ago. That'll take ES6 code, turn it into ES5. And then REPL.it, this is a new in-browser code editor that I've been playing around with. Sort of, basically, it's just a playground that lets you play with these new features and see what they do without having to transpile it. So that's the end of the slides. So let's actually get into what this does. So can everyone read this? People in the back? Cool. Okay, so let's start with the new variable types. So let's say const name is going to be Carson. Pretty easy, basically the same thing as what you normally would have. And then we'll say, let's do let age equal 24. So let can be changed. So the age here is actually going to be able to change. So we can do age plus plus, do this, increment the age, and then we're going to do, and we'll see that it changes. So run it. So you see it printed out 24, and then it printed out 25. That's fine. Let's get rid of this. So here's the interesting part with const. You can't change it. And we're going to try that here in a second. So name equals, let's do Michael. So first thing that's going to happen is REPL is actually pretty nice in that it will tell you when you're trying to do something that is quote unquote illegal in the language. So right here it says attempting to override name with which is a constant. So if I try to run this, it's going to throw an error. So that says syntax error, assignment to constant variable name at, and then line number. So you can't do that. So where this actually comes in handy is when you are, so a couple weeks ago we talked about sort of different programming styles. I believe Aaron Krause actually spoke about that. So you guys check out that video on Twitch if you haven't already. So one of the programming styles, and one that I like a lot, is called functional programming. Basically, when a value is declared, you never touch it again. You don't change it. You don't do anything with it. You can pass it into functions, and then that function can then return something, some calculation based on that. But you can't mutate that variable. Pardon me. So that just makes it so that you don't have as many weird bugs. A lot more bugs pop up when you're starting to mutate state, which is what that would basically be doing, is if you pass in a variable, it changes, and then yeah. Does that make sense? Not really, sort of, kind of. It gets a lot more, once you actually start working with it, it makes a lot more sense. So let's see, the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be object literals. So we're going to use that example that I had a minute ago. So we're going to declare a new object. And so inside of this, we're going to say age, or I guess name, and age. That's all you have to do. So before, you would have to do this. Before ES6, you would actually have to go in and you'd have to declare what each of those properties is. ES6 provides this really neat, better syntax to make it just, it's a little cleaner. You don't have as much to write. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and console log that just to show what that looks like. Just to prove that it does basically the same thing. So yeah, so we've got an object that comes back, we've got a name and an age variable, and those are set to what those variables were set as. Next, we'll show you what, so an object, a function or a method inside of an object. So we've got say name, function, and we're going to return this dot name. So this is what I was talking about a minute ago with the keyword this. So this is actually going to refer to this object, so this Carson object. I'll show you what it does. So Carson.sayName, we're going to call it. This is just going to, it should print out my name. And it did. So, whoops, pardon me. Next thing we're going to do, so we want a greeting. So my greeting is, I want it to say my name and I also want it to say my age. So the first thing is we're going to use string literals and this idea of interpolation. So we're going to use the backtick characters. So that's the one right next to your one key. I'm going to say, hello, my name is, and then there's that interpolation symbol. So you've got the $ plus brackets. We're going to do Carson dot say name, if I can type. So what this does right here is it will evaluate that function and then return whatever that's being returned, it will place into the string. And I am Carson.age, years old. I'll show you what that looks like. So console log greeting. Go and run it. And you see it prints out, hello, my name is Carson, I'm 24 years old. So what it just did there is it went and ran that say name function that's placed on the Carson object, and it returned the name. Does everyone understand where that came from? And then the same thing is it went and grabbed my age off of that object, and it's basically turning it into a string. We won't get into why that happens, though. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about, so object and array destructuring. So this is actually a really, really cool feature. So basically it allows you to pluck off different properties or different variables from an object or an array without actually having to do this weird. So normally what you would do, so say I wanted to get my age. So you could say const Carson's age is equal to Carson.age. So that's a little verbose. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and you have to understand what is truly going on. So we don't get into some weird name spacing issues, we're going to go ahead and comment this out. So we've got this new object. So I'll use the same example as what we did earlier. So we've got val1 is equal to the number 1, val2 is equal to the number 2. So now what you can do is say I want to pull off val1, and I want to be able to use that later on. So instead of calling my object.val1, I can just say val1 inside of curly braces. So that will tell the interpreter to that what you're looking at on the right-hand side is going to be an object. And then it'll say my object. Just to prove that that's what happened, we're going to go ahead and console log val1. And there you go. So what it did was it went and it said, okay, I'm looking at an object, and I'm looking for this property named val1. And it's going to return that and store it in a variable named val1. So now what happens if we decide to try and do something that's not within the object? So let's say val3. Can anybody guess what's going to happen? Yeah. So it's actually going to return undefined because that object doesn't exist. So the same thing can be done with arrays. So const my array. Oh, and mind you, so one thing to keep in mind with this is that the variables that you pass in for destructuring have to be named the exact same thing as a property in the object you're trying to pull from. So let's see. So we've got my array. We're going to give it values 3 and 4. So we're going to do the same thing. So so array destructuring is a little bit different. It actually is indexed. So we're going to say I want the second thing from there. or I guess I just want the first thing. So we're going to say val3 is equal to my array. Val3 has already been declared. Has it? Yes, it has. Excuse me. So val3 should, can anybody guess what val3 is going to return if we console log it? Right. Console.log val3. So what that did is it pulled off the first thing. So what if I just want the 4? I don't really care about val3, but I don't really care about that 3 number, but I want the 4. So let's say val4. What you can do is you can put as many commas in as there are values in the array and whatever you're put in with a variable name is going to be declared as a variable. So here, I'm going to try val3 again. That should return undefined. .log, if I can type, val4. So we'll run that. And it throws an error. So val3 is not defined. We'll go ahead and comment that out. Run it again. I apparently can't spell. And it printed out it's going to print out number 4. So this is really, really handy when you are, so what we're going to get into Angular 2/4/5 and React here in a couple weeks, beginning of the year. And these come in really handy when you're trying to pull stuff off of the state in like a React component. So what I mean by that, say we've got this state object, and it's like, again, so name Carson, age 24, and so on and so forth. What you can do is say I just want the name off of this object, and that's the only thing that I'm going to be using, and that's the only really thing I want. So const name equals state, and we'll console log the name. Unexpected token. Turns out you actually do have to put equal signs everywhere. So we'll run this, and it's going to return Carson. So I'm going to stop for a second. Does anybody have any questions? Anything they can think of? Okay, cool. We're going to go ahead and move on. So the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be, and I'll go ahead and, for this, I'm going to go ahead and uncomment my 2 examples from earlier. So you have my object and we've got my array. So we're going to talk about the spread operator first. So this is the one that I see most commonly used. And it makes copying objects and it makes adding things to objects super simple. So who remembers when I said that in functional programming you don't mutate variables, or at least you try not to. So let's say I want everything from that original object. So let me go ahead and delete this stuff. I want everything from this original object, but I want to add stuff to it. Typically, you don't want to just go ahead and say, oh, my object dot whatever equals something else. So instead, what we'll do, my new object, I'm going to spread the old array, or the old object, with those 3 periods. And then I'm going to add a new property. So new prop is going to be something like, I'm a new prop. So the fun thing about this is it's not ever going to modify my object. So we can prove that with doing that. And we'll console log this new object. And then just show that it didn't change, we'll say console.log my object again. And we'll go ahead and run it. So we've got val1, so we've got the original object. So we've got val1, val2. We've got the new object. So this is going to be val1, val2, and then the new prop. And then we've got that old object again, just to show that it didn't change. You can do the same thing with arrays. So say I wanted to add, so I've got this new array, and I've got a couple additional values. I've got 1, 2, 3. Yeah, let's just say 1 and 2. And in normal JavaScript, can anybody guess how you would basically take that new array and add it to my array up here? So we'll go ahead and, yeah. So in normal JavaScript, in older versions of JavaScript, you would go ahead and loop through it. Let I equals 0, I less than, see, it's been a while since I've actually done this. Length, and then I plus plus, and then you would say my array dot push new array at I. That's annoying, that's verbose, that's kind of gross, and it's very, you're telling the computer what to do rather than, so this gets into something called declarative versus imperative programming. So in imperative programming, you're telling the computer what to do, how to do it. In declarative program, you say, this is what I want you to do, I don't care how you do it. So I'll show you what this actually does. So let's go ahead and console log the old array, and that will now have four values in it. So yeah, it's 3, 4, 1, 2. So I don't like that. I don't like using for loops. There are better things for us to use nowadays. So the way that we will do this, so let's say concatenated array, and we're going to say I want everything from the new array first, so we're going to spread the new array, and I want everything from the old array, so my array. Now what this should do, it should do basically the same thing. It's not going to loop over it. It's actually, I don't know exactly what it's doing on the inside of it, but it does something similar. So console.log concatenated array. So we'll run it, and there you go. So it basically spread out those variables from the array. One of the gotchas with this is that this only goes one level deep. So if you have an array within an array, so say this was like that. So inside of that array, you've got another array. It's only going to copy the array as it is. So I'll show you what that means. So you have 1, 2, and then you've got an array with 2 values in it. And there are, frankly, in this context, I would probably use a library to actually flatten those arrays. But if somebody, so one of the algorithm scripting challenges for Free Code Camp is to actually flatten an array, a nested array. So this is a good place to try that. So I believe it says not to use ES6, but to go ahead and learn how to do that without any of the additional helpers. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be, we're going to get into functions. And some of the stuff that's changed with functions. So I'm going to go ahead and declare a function, and it's going to look really weird for a minute. So const add is going to be a and b, and I'm going to return a plus b. That looks a little funny. So what this looks like in normal speak, in normal JavaScript, so we've got this function, and we're going to say subtract. It's going to take a and b, and it's going to return a minus b. So those do, aside from what they're doing technically, so despite their functionality, they do basically the same thing. So what this second function is doing is what's known as implicit returning. This is what an arrow function looks like. These are really helpful when you are trying to declare something in line. So say we've got, so like in my example, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're trying to, does everybody know what the reduce method on arrays does? No? So basically what reduce does is it actually will take an array and turn it into a single value. So it takes an accumulator. So I'm going to show you what this looks like in ES6 or in ES5. So function takes an accumulator and the number. It takes a default, or it takes an initial value, and then you have to return the accumulator plus that n. And I'll show you what this does. So we're going to do const reduced equals that. Keep those there for posterity. And so we'll console log reduced. And that returns 15. That's what it's supposed to return. Problem is that's a little verbose. The way that we sort of declared that, it's what's known as an anonymous function, so it can only be used right then and there. I don't particularly like it, so let's try something else. So we're actually going to use basically this. So we'll say const ES6 reduced. And say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dot reduce. Now here's where the sort of trickery comes into play. So we're going to say accumulator and n. We're going to use the arrow, and then we're going to implicitly return the accumulator plus n, and then give it the default. So this will basically return the exact same thing. So to prove that, it returned 15. You can make this look a little bit like the old version by surrounding this with brackets, and then obviously returning something. It does the same thing, so we'll run it again. So arrow functions were one of those things that sort of were a little weird for me to begin with. But once I got used to them, once I figured them out, they make your life a little easier. They make things, they make declaring and using functions, and inline functions especially, a lot less verbose and a lot less time consuming. They're also very, like I said, declarative. So I'm telling the browser, I've got these two things, and this is what I want you to do with it. Okay. So go ahead and comment this out. So from now on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that arrow function to declare any functions I do. So let's go back to where we've got these add and subtract functions. So let's do subtract. So subtract equals a function where we've got x and y. We're going to return x minus y. So what happens if we don't have a y? So this will work, but there's a lot of cases where if you don't give a function that second variable, it's going to, or that second argument, it's going to fail. So let's go ahead and declare that y, if given nothing else, is going to be 0. So, and then we'll call it subtract, and we'll say, so let's show what happens when you do just like 5 minus 4. That should equal 1. That should return 1. And it did. So what happens if I don't give it that y value? I'm not giving it the y value is going to say 0, and it's going to return that. To make this a little more, you can see this a little better. Let's change the default value of y to 1. So this should return 4. After calling it, and it did. So this is great when you are working on, when you're working through something and you have a function that may or may not be passed that second variable, but it has to be passed something. So if you give it a default, it knows what to use. This is used a lot in Redux, which we won't get into what exactly that means, but Redux requires that every single time you call the function, it has to have a state passed in. If there's no state or some initial state passed in, it's going to fail. It's going to be like, I don't know what to do with this. And we'll get into that once we get into the Angular 5 and React sections beginning of the year. Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about are classes. So classes are a little funny in JavaScript. So before, we could declare a class with a constructor function. So we're going to say, so function animal is I'm just going to have num legs and just say color. And what we can do with this is we can then say this dot num legs equals num legs, and then this dot color is equal to color. So is everybody familiar with what this sort of syntax does? If not, I'm about to show you. So what we can then do is we can say const dog is an animal, new animal. And it's going to have 4 legs and it's going to be brown. And then so what we'll do is I'll show you what that dog looks like now. So does anybody have a guess about what that is? What that's going to look like? No? So it's going to return an animal object. So it's got num legs and it's got a color. So let's change this up a little bit, make this a little more ES6 friendly. So we're going to use that class keyword. So we've got class animal. So one of the normal things to do is go ahead and use uppercase letters for classes. I believe, is that the same in object-oriented languages? Yeah, for the most part. So yeah, so we're going to go ahead and say class animal, and then we're going to give it a constructor. And we're going to say, I want num legs as well, and color. What is it yelling at me for? Oop. We've got constructor, and what this constructor does is it does the exact same thing as this function up here. So we're going to say this dot num legs is equal to num legs, and this dot color is equal to color. And just to show that this does the same thing, and run it. And it's the same thing, or it comes out with the same object. Now, why this is so nice, so this particular syntax is nice, is that before, say I wanted to declare a function inside of this. A little more difficult. So it would be something like, speak. Oop. So this dot speak is a function that says, I guess I could give it a sound. And it will console.log the sound. It's a little verbose, it's a little more annoying. So down here, let me go ahead and comment this out. Excuse me. Really, all you have to do is you declare it as a function. Speak, and we'll do sound again. If I can type, apparently I can't. And we'll do console.log this.sound. So, and I'll show you what that looks like. So, woof. Console.log, let's just do dog.speak. We'll run it, and it says woof. Pretty simplistic example. You'll see this a lot more once we get into those frameworks that I talked about a minute ago. These are used extensively in both frameworks, and it's an incredibly important thing to learn how to use, because that's what those frameworks are all about. So that's really the end of the sort of demonstration. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Well, so define static class for me.
So when you instantiate, you're not creating non-existence.
That I don't know. I haven't dug that deep. You can create static variables within a. So like, so you're talking about static. Someone give me a variable name. Anybody? So size, let's just do that. And then we'll declare that as medium. So every animal we have is going to be a medium. Class properties must be methods. Excuse me. So what this will do is that'll attach the size static variable to the object, to the class. Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is going to be babbljs.com. So babbljs is a JavaScript. It says it's called a compiler, but really what it's doing is it's transpiling your code for you, taking it from ES6 syntax and turning it into ES5. So we'll go ahead and hit the Try It Now button up top. And so this will bring us up to an editor. And we can play around with some settings. For the most part, you don't need to. But let's try out some of those things and see what happens in what that looks like in ES5. So let's use this. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. So let's use this animal class. So we're going to go ahead and copy it over. That's what happens in ES5. In order to do something very similar, that's what goes on in ES5. Now we can ignore pretty much everything through line 5, and then on line 7, we have basically that same objects, that same instantiation syntax we saw earlier, that same construction syntax. So we've got the var animal, it's a function, and then inside of that we've got a constructor in this case, and it's going to say we've got num legs, the color, we've got the sound, all that. That's basically what it's doing behind the scenes, behind the curtains. Let's see, what's another one that we want to look at? One that's easy to understand. Oh, so let's do arrow syntax. So const add is equal to AB, and it's going to return A plus B. This should be a little easier to see. So it basically, what Babel is going to do is it's going to take that ES6 syntax and it's going to turn it into something understandable by pretty much every browser. There are some browsers that don't support certain things that you'll see in ES6, and even when they're compiled down to ES5, so Internet Explorer being one of them. But for the most part, you don't need to worry about it too much. So yeah, so that's what Babel is. If you guys are interested in playing around with ES6 and starting to see what all you can do with it, this is a great place to go and just try some things out, just see what it does. Yeah. So does anybody have any final questions? Yes, no, maybe? Cool. So before